How many people have seen me talk here before at Agile Australia, just to know how many people are? And you came back. Wow, I'm impressed. If you've seen me talk before at Agile Australia, or indeed at any conference, you know pretty much every time I give a talk, I call it Software Design in the 21st Century, or something like that, because it's a vague title and I can talk about whatever I like. And I was going to do that again here. But I decided actually, no, I was going to decide to do something specific, which was to talk about where we are, the Agile community, in 2018. And I decided I'd do not something that particularly deeply planned talk with lots of slides and clever diagrams and beautiful transitions, but just me yakking, talking through a plan, which I've kind of done before, but it's been a while, so we'll see how we go. Somebody was going to put a timer in the front here, and I don't see a timer. So that could be a disaster. So if somebody gives me a timer, that might be handy. So as we look at the state of Agile, in many ways, on a kind of surface level, things are looking very, very good. I mean, look at the size of this crowd, for instance. We're huge. We're fitting in this big conference place, actually not fitting in very well because it was pretty crowded out there. You go to all sorts of places and you see Agile scattered around. Somebody sent me a Harvard Business Review cover with Agile on it. I mean, it's all over the place. So that's a big shift from 10 years ago here, or even longer when we were in that ski place at Snowbird, talking about what the hell we should call ourselves. And it sounds like success. But you talk to a lot of old-time Agilists, people who were doing it before it was called Agile, like in the late 90s, and there's actually a lot of disquiet, a lot of disappointment, a lot of unhappiness in the air. That's actually not unusual because it's been like that pretty much the whole time, as far as I can tell. And that's actually a good thing because it's a sign of dissatisfaction is a sign of wanting to improve. But it does lead that sense of, well, why are we struggling? What's the problem? And what's the current challenge that we're having to face? Back 10 years ago, the challenge was people taking Agile at all seriously. I remember going into one of our big clients, one of the big ThoughtWorks clients in Australia. And they wanted me to give the usual Martin Fowler come in, give us a talk kind of routine. And somebody from the clients had said, yeah, we want you to talk whatever you like, but don't say anything about that Agile stuff. Which was a bit of an alarming thing in the mid-2000s when I was talking a lot about Agile. But that was the sense then, a sense that this was something kind of bad and you didn't want to talk about. Now, it's everywhere. It's popular. But there's been an important shift. It was summed up quite nicely by a colleague of mine who said, in the old days, when we talked about doing Agile, there was always this pushback right from the beginning from a client. And that would bring out some important conversations that we would have. Now, they say, oh yeah, we're doing Agile already. But you go in there, and you suddenly find there's some very big differences to what we expect to be doing as ThoughtWorks. And we like to think ourselves we're very deeply steeped in Agile notions. And yet we go into a company that says, yeah, we're doing Agile, it's no problem, and we find a very different world to what we expect. Our challenge at the moment isn't making Agile a thing that people want to do, it's dealing with what I call faux Agile. Agile that's just the name, but none of the practices and values in place. Ron Jeffries often refers to it as dark Agile, or specifically dark Scrum, where it's actually even worse than we're just pretending to do it. We're just actively using it against the basic principles of what we were trying to do when we talked about doing this in the late 90s and then at Snowbird. So that's our current battle. It's not about getting Agile respectable enough to have a crowd like this come to a conference like this. It's realizing that a lot of what people are doing and calling Agile just isn't. And we have to recognize that and fight against it, because some people will say, oh, we've got to go post-Agile, we've got to come up with some new word, but that doesn't help the fundamental problem. It's the values and principles that count, and we have to address and keep pushing those forwards, and we might as well use that same label, but we've got to let people know what it really stands for. So if that's the broad level of the problem, how do we kind of focus on particular things? And I want to focus on 3 main problem areas that I think are the ones that I would like to highlight, the ones that I think are most worthy of our attention. And the first one of these is what I would call the Agile industrial complex. And, you know, to be fair, I'm part of it, right? I mean, I'm standing on the stage here talking about Agile. But you also talk, and we're all part of it to some degree. Many of us are parts of some kind of Agile consulting firms, probably with Agile in the title. But a lot of what is being pushed in a way that, as I said, goes really against a lot of our precepts. And in particular, one of the really central things that impressed me very much about the early Agile advocates was this realization that people are operating at the best when they choose how they want to work. When we talked about the Agile Manifesto and laid out the 4 value statements, most of those value statements we didn't really care very much, if I remember correctly, about what order they came in. But we did have an opinion about the first one, which is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And that was, to me, crystallized a very important part of what Agile thinking about. If you want to succeed in doing software development, you need to find good people, and you need to find good people that work together at a human level, at a human sense, and they can collaborate effectively. The choice of what tools they use or what process they should follow is second order. And I thought that's a very important statement to come from what was basically a gathering of process weenies. I mean, we were all process guys to some extent or other. And yet we were acknowledging that what we were talking about was actually of secondary importance. What matters is that the team chooses its own path. And it goes further than that. That the team should actually not just choose this process that they follow on, but they should be actively encouraged to continue to evolve it and change it as they go. One of the things about any kind of Agile process or Agile method is that it is inherently very slippery. It changes week to week, month to month. One of the quotes that I used to flash around people was, if you're doing extreme programming the same way as you were doing it a year ago, you're no longer doing extreme programming. Because if you don't take charge and you don't alter things to fit your circumstance, then you are missing a key part of it. Now, there are various rituals and things that we can set up to make this work, and retrospectives are clearly a technique that lots of people find to be really very central. In fact, I think Ron Jeffries joked that Alistair Coburn's approach to Agile was come together in peace and harmony and deliver software every week and do a retro every time to figure out how you can improve. The retrospective is really such a central part of the practice. Now, it actually doesn't matter whether you actually have a formal retrospective. It doesn't matter whether you have 4 or 5 labels of things, exactly how you do it. But the notion of thinking about what we are doing and how we can do better, and it is the team that's doing the work that does this, that is the central thing. Now, this is a reaction against the whole Frederick Taylor separate process people. How many people here know the story of Frederick Taylor and his approach? How many people have come across the name Frederick Taylor? Have even heard of him? A few more. A lot more of you should raise your hands. He's probably one of the most important figures in the history of the 20th century in terms of how it's actually affected people's day-to-day lives. He was actually from the late 19th century in America, and he was very interested in trying to make people more efficient in the industrial workplaces that were developing at that time. And his view of the average worker was that they were lazy, venal, and stupid. And therefore, you didn't want them to decide how it was that they should make a particular piece of machinery, but somebody else, somebody who was sort of more intelligent and educated, they should figure out exactly the best way to do it. Even going down to, do I do this and then that, or do I do that and then this? I mean, a very scripted sense of motion and movements. The whole time and motion industry kind of came out of that. But at the heart of this notion was the people who are doing the work should not decide how to do it. It should be a separate group of planners who does this. And that strongly affected manufacturing, factory work through much of the early 20th century. And it affected the software industry as well. So people said, oh, but we need software process experts to figure out how to do things. And then programmers can kind of just fit in the slots in the different places. But interestingly, just as the software people were talking about how we need to kind of follow this very Taylorist notion that that was the future of software development, I mean, I heard people saying that back in the 80s and 90s, the manufacturing world was moving away from it. The whole notion of what was going on in a lot of manufacturing places was, no, actually the people doing the work, they need to have much more of a say in this because they actually see what's happening. And so the Agile movement was part of trying to push that, to try to say the teams involved in doing the work should decide how it gets done. Because let's face it, we're talking about software developers here, people who are well-paid, well-educated, hopefully well-motivated people. And so they should figure out what's in their particular case is necessary. And again, that particular case becomes important because different kinds of software are different. I've lived most of my life in enterprise application, database-backed, GUI, web front-end kind of world stuff. That's what most of the people I know do, but that's very different to designing telephone switches or designing printer-embedded software. And even within that world that I'm relatively familiar with, different teams have different kinds of situations. And we have different legacy environments to coordinate with. And we have different dynamics between the individuals on a team. With so many differences, how can we say there's one way that's going to work for everybody? We can't. And yet what I'm hearing so much from the Agile industrial complex is imposing methods upon people. And that, to me, is an absolute travesty. I was going to say tragedy, but I think travesty is the better word. Because in the end, there is no one-size-fits-all in software development. Even the Agile advocates wouldn't say that Agile is necessarily the best thing to use everywhere. The point is the team doing the work decides how to do it. That is a fundamental Agile principle that even means if the team doesn't want to work in an Agile way, then Agile probably isn't appropriate in that context. And that's the most Agile way they can do things, in some kind of strangely twisted word of logic. So that's the first thing. The Agile industrial complex and this imposition of one best ways of doing things. That's something we must fight against. The second thing I'm going to pick off is the lack of recognition of the importance of technical excellence to what we do. A lot of Agile conferences I go to don't tend to talk very much about the actual techniques of writing software. How many people here are software developers, by the way? A smattering, but actually very much a minority. The same problem was true at the Agile Alliance's main conference for quite a while, that they realized that they were getting a lot of people who were involved on the project management side and things of that kind, but not very many people who were the technical people who actually did the work. And that's actually quite tragic. It led to an even more tragic thing of some software developers saying, oh, we need to create a whole new world for ourselves, the software craftsmanship movement, where we can go away, get away from all of these business experts and project managers and business analysts and just talk about our technical stuff. But that's a terrible thing, because the whole point of Agile is to combine right across these different areas. That the lowliest, juniorist programmer tapping away on JavaScript should be connected to people who are out there thinking about the business issues and business strategies even of the group that they're working with. And I'll say a bit more about that in my third point. But that means we've got to pay attention to these technical skills. And we have to think about how do we nurture those, how do they grow, how do we make that important? I've spent the last couple of years, as my primary writing exercise, coming up with a new edition of the book about refactoring. How many people here have heard about refactoring? Good. How many people could accurately describe it to people, do you think? Rather less. It's a very core technique to the whole Agile way of thinking because it fits in with the whole way in which we can build software in a way that it can change easily. When I just summarize Agile to people, I usually say there is two main pieces to it. One I've already talked about, the primacy of the individual and not the individual, of the team and the team's choices of how they do things. But the other is our ability to change rapidly, to be able to deal with change easily. I always love Mary Poppendieck's phrase, a late change in requirements is a competitive advantage. But to do that, you need software that's designed in a way that's able to react to that kind of change. Refactoring is central to this because refactoring is a disciplined way of making changes. It's a horrible thing to hear when somebody tweets something along the lines of, oh, I'm refactoring my software at the moment, so it's going to be broken for the next 2 weeks. That's not refactoring. Refactoring is small changes, each of which keeps everything working. It doesn't change the observable behavior of the software. That's its definition. And I should know because I was the one who got to define it. So it's lots of small changes, none of which actually change the observable part of the software, but all of which change its internal structure. Usually because you want to make some new feature and the current internal structure doesn't fit very well that new feature. So you change the structure to make the new feature easy to fit in, all the time refactoring and not breaking anything, and then you put it in. Ken Beck summarizes this, when you want to make a change, first make the change easy, warning, this may be hard, then make the easy change. And that's a very crucial role of refactoring. But it goes beyond that in refactoring because refactoring is a constant thing. You're looking at some code and you're trying to say, well, what does this do? I don't really understand what this does. Let me think about this. Let's burrow in. Now I understand what this code does. Then before you move on, you take this, Ward Cunningham used this phrase, you take the understanding out of your head and you put it into the code. By restructuring it, by renaming it. Naming is a really important part of all of this. So that the next time you or somebody else comes through that same piece of code, you don't have to go through that puzzle exercise. Why is this important? Because if you want to make changes, you want to change things quickly, you've got to quickly understand which parts of the program matter and what do they do and how do they work so that I can quickly make that change. So this also then burrows up into modularity. If I've got a well-modularized piece of software, instead of having to understand the whole thing, I can just understand part of it. Technical excellence is about being able to build that kind of adaptive software. And then you get a self-reinforcing principle comes in. Once you realize that I can change software quickly to add new things, I don't try to make the software do everything I want it to do right at the beginning, because I don't need to, because I'll be able to change things later on. This is the principle of Yagni. You aren't going to need it. Don't add features to the software until you need them, because if you do, it bloats the software and makes it harder to understand. But that strategy is totally hopeless without a good refactoring techniques. And then refactoring relies on testing. And refactoring also relies on continuous integration. And together with continuous integration, you have the practice of continuous delivery and the notion that we're going to be able to release the software very, very frequently. And in some organizations, we actually do release the software very, very frequently. Now, there's a notion out there that says that rapid release of software can only be done if you're prepared to put up with lots and lots of errors. And if you want software to be reliable, you do things in a much more slow, deliberate way. Wrong. And we're seeing more and more evidence piled up that that's very, very wrong. My favorite book of the year so far, I think it's going to be the best book of the year, and I say that with great sadness because my book's going to come out this year, but I'm hoping for number 2, is Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, and Gene Kim, where they, through the process of looking at lots of data, based on surveys of organizations, start to show how different practices affect things. And one of the things that they demonstrate very clearly from their work is releasing many times a day and low defect rates go together. Because you can't release many times a day unless you figure out how to get your defect rates down. And that requires the kinds of practices we talk about. Automated testing, refactoring, Yagni, all of this stuff flows together. The most important things about extreme programming is that the individual practices of extreme programming reinforce to each other. And that's why that principle is so important. And then the third thing that I want to stress is the importance of getting rid of software projects as a notion. But we want to instead switch to a product-oriented view of the world, where instead of projects that you spin up, run for a while, and then stop, you instead say, let's focus on things that are much more long-lasting and organize a product team around that. Another way of thinking about it is, what are the business capabilities that the organization has, and then organize the teams around those. And these business capabilities will be long-lasting. And they will necessarily mean combining together technical people and the people who are much more on the business side of things, the non-technical people, into that same team. Whenever I hear people talk about a very popular notion, a well-known notion at the moment, is the Amazon two-pizza team. And people talk about this all the time. Organize yourself into two pizza teams, maybe with a little side joke about how American pizzas are really, really big, so they can perhaps be bigger teams than you might think. But when they give that description, they often miss off something that's quite clear whenever I hear Amazon people talk about this, which is that each of those teams needs to connect right the way through to the customer. So that each team is focused on some aspect of the customer's experience, some aspect of what Cathy Sierra calls making the customer kick ass at what they do. And then that alters our notion of what that small team does. Because if the small teams are focused on some piece of customer experience, some way of making the customer do what they do better, then that tells us how we should draw our lines between our small teams. Now, it's not always easy to do this, but it should, I think, be the driving notion. But again, we often see it violated. I went to one supposedly agile organization. I was chatting with a development team. There was about half a dozen programmers. They were writing software. Their direct customers were members of the other organization, senior planners in retail planning. And there was only 4 users of the software that they were writing. 6 developers, 4 users. They had never spoken to each other. They weren't allowed to. Instead, there was a Scrum product owner who was managing the conversation between them. Well, actually, there'd been 4 product owners over the course of a year. I mean, what nightmare world of Agile is this that they can dare use the word Agile to describe that notion? When we were talking about names for Agile software development, Kent Beck suggested conversational, because the notion was this ongoing conversation between software developers, business people, anybody involved in making that customer experience better. And that was a constant degree. If I was on that team as a developer, I'd want to be on first name terms with all of the users. I'd want to be talking, I'd want to watch what they do. I'd want to understand how they think about making their customers happier and see that whole flow. So we need to think about that. That's my third challenge. So my 3 things that we should face ourselves as challenges. Get rid of the agile industrial complex and the idea of imposing stuff on teams. Let teams work out the way they should work themselves. Raise the importance of technical excellence, and never forget that writing software, the technology side, is really vital. And organize around products. So that sounds kind of a little bit negative, because I've talked about the problems of this current state of Agile. But I have 2 minutes and 45 seconds left to offer perhaps one reason why I'm not too depressed about the situation. And it comes from probably my favorite thing about the whole Agile Manifesto, which didn't occur in Snowbird when we wrote it, but occurred about 6 months later in Tampa, Florida at Uppsala, where most of the people who wrote the manifesto were together with a bunch of other interested people. At this point, the Agile Manifesto had taken off in a way that we could never have imagined. And suddenly it was clear there was this huge opportunity for doing interesting things. And many people wanted to say, we need to set up a real organization here. And one of the questions was, should that original 17 people that wrote Manifesto take a special place in this ongoing effort? And the thing I'm proud of that we 17 people did is we said no. We wrote the manifesto, we did a nice piece of work, we'll be part of what goes on in the future, but we have no special role in that. That role has to grow forwards. And new people will come in and do great things, which is indeed what happened. And one of the ways that was very important was there was a big problem, particularly looking at it now with 2018 glasses, at that group of people who wrote the manifesto. 17 people. 17 white, middle-aged guys. Not a thread of diversity there. But because we let go, the Agile world could incorporate many people from all sorts of backgrounds who took part in that. Mary Poppendick was one of the big leaders of the early Agile Alliance efforts. Rebecca Parsons, my boss at ThoughtWorks, was the chair of the Agile Alliance for a long time. I go to an Agile conference and I tend to see much more women than I do in other kinds of software conferences. That's a good thing. Certainly wasn't the work of us at the beginning. We weren't even thinking about that. But the point was, because we let go, we ended up with a community that could develop things themselves, that could tackle challenges that we hadn't even imagined and work on them. And it's that constant learning and growing and changing as a community which is our greatest strength. I spoke not that long ago to someone who is a latecomer to the Agile world, who said that they found a degree of welcomingness and openness to people coming in that wasn't true of many other groups. And that made me really, really happy. Because as long as we can be that, as long as we can be that flexible, as long as we can always change, then whatever challenges we face, I think we have a future. Thank you.